Hey everyone, and welcome to Whisper Bloom. Tonight, we're not just going to tell you a story, we're going to take a little trip back in time, to a place shrouded in mist and mystery, a place that might just be taking a very, very long nap. You know, the kind of nap where you wake up and realize you've missed a few thousand years of history, and maybe a few good meals. So, get ready, because we're diving into the legendary tale of Atlantis, or rather, what probably just happened to it, which might be a bit less dramatic than the blockbusters make it out to be. If you enjoy tonight's story, please remember to like and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss a single one of our bedtime escapes. We'd also love for you to share your city, current time, and how you're feeling in the comments below. Now, take a deep breath, relax your body and mind, let all your thoughts drift away, and get ready to join us for story time. You were just a kid, really, or at least, that's how it felt. The kind of kid who spent more time with their nose buried in dusty old books than, well, anywhere else. While other kids were out mastering the art of the perfect cannonball splash or debating the merits of various sugary cereals, you were lost in the annals of time, poring over ancient texts and deciphering faded maps. You weren't exactly built for athletic feats, unless speed reading counted, and your idea of a thrilling adventure usually involved a library card and a comfortable chair. But there was this one story, wasn't there? This one whisper that always seemed to follow you, a tantalizing echo from the distant past. Atlantis.it wasn't something you'd actively sought out, it just found you. Maybe it was that tattered copy of Plato's Dialogues you'd snagged from a second-hand bookstore, smelling faintly of old coffee and forgotten dreams. Or perhaps it was the late-night documentaries, flickering on a dusty screen, promising untold wonders beneath the waves. You'd scoffed, of course. Who wouldn't? A city of advanced technology, golden temples, and wise philosopher kings, swallowed whole by the ocean in a single, cataclysmic night. Sounds like something your overly imaginative little cousin would cook up after too much sugar, right? But then, the whispers started to become a bit louder. They crept into your idle thoughts, while you were stirring your morning coffee, or gazing out a rainy window. You'd find yourself doodling strange patterns in your notebook, patterns that vaguely resembled concentric circles or angular, futuristic structures. You'd catch yourself scanning newspaper headlines for any mention of strange underwater discoveries, your internal radar pinging whenever the word ancient appeared. It was like a catchy song you couldn't get out of your head, only instead of a pop anthem, it was the siren call of a lost civilization. One particularly dull Tuesday evening, while you were supposed to be studying for a history exam, a topic far less exciting, something about the agricultural revolution, you stumbled upon it. Not in a book this time, but online, deep in the rabbit hole of obscure academic forums. Someone had posted a grainy image of what looked like an ancient tablet fragment, covered in symbols that were eerily familiar to the doodles in your notebook. The accompanying text, a rambling, excited diatribe, claimed it was proof. Proof of Atlantis. Your initial reaction was, naturally, a heavy sigh and an eye roll that could have dislodged a small satellite. Oh, here we go, you muttered, half expecting to see a link to a conspiracy theory website selling Atlantis energy crystals. But then, something snagged your attention. The author of the post, a certain Leo, seemed genuinely passionate, almost feverish, about their findings. They spoke of geological anomalies, unusual deep-sea currents, and patterns of ancient settlements that just didn't quite fit the mainstream narrative. And that's when it hit you, this wasn't some crackpot, this was just another you, but maybe a little further down the rabbit hole. That night, sleep didn't come easy. The whispers had found a megaphone. You lay there, staring at the ceiling, picturing magnificent cities submerged beneath turquoise waters, their secrets guarded by silent, knowing fish. You imagined the people, their lives, their triumphs, and their inevitable, mysterious downfall. And for the first time, the idea of Atlantis wasn't just a fantasy, it was a puzzle, a grand, intricate jigsaw scattered across the ocean floor, just waiting for someone to put the pieces together. You, with your slightly clumsy but intensely curious spirit, felt a strange pull. A pull to understand what really happened. You were about to find out just how much digging, and maybe a little bit of swimming, that would entail. The whispers had grown into a full-blown siren song, and you, bless your curious heart, were absolutely hooked. You spent the next few weeks in a blur of late-night research, powered by questionable instant coffee and an insatiable need to know more. Your desk, usually a pristine monument to procrastination, became a chaotic archaeological dig site of its own, stacks of books on geology, oceanography, ancient history, and even a questionable guide to deciphering lost languages. You were a one-person, slightly disheveled research team, and your target was clear: Atlantis. Amongst the academic journals and wild conspiracy theories, you skimmed those for entertainment, of course, just to remind yourself how far down the rabbit hole some folks had gone. You kept circling back to something truly intriguing, a faded, barely legible reproduction of an old map. It wasn't just any old map, it was an oddity, tucked away in the appendix of a dense, obscure 19th-century geographical treatise. Most of the map depicted familiar coastlines, albeit with charmingly inaccurate squiggles for rivers and mountains. But in the vast, blue expanse of the Atlantic, right where you'd least expect it, there was a faint, almost ghostly outline of an island. An island unlike any you'd seen on modern charts, with intricate lines radiating from a central point, hinting at a structured, perhaps even artificial, landscape. The map's creator was credited only as AN, and the accompanying text was even more cryptic, speaking of ancient seafaring tales and uncharted territories visited by the enlightened. It was just vague enough to be tantalizing, just specific enough to feel real. It didn't scream Lost City of Gold or alien underwater base. Instead, it whispered, there was something here. And that something was enough to ignite a spark within you that even your perpetually skeptical nature couldn't extinguish. You showed the map, or rather, your blurry printout of it, to Leo. He was your anaphysai. Al partner in archaeological crime, a fellow history enthusiast you'd met in a surprisingly riveting ancient pottery class. Leo, with his perpetually rumpled clothes and an unshakable belief that every historical mystery had a perfectly logical, albeit often very bizarre, explanation, was the perfect foil to your cautious optimism. He squinted at the map, ran a finger along the faded lines, and then, slowly, a grin spread across his face. You know, he mumbled, this looks suspiciously like what I've been digging up in those old nautical logbooks. Anomalous currents, unusual depth readings, uncharted shoals, it all started around the same era. Your heart did a little flutter. This wasn't just a random piece of paper, it was a potential link, a thread in the cosmic tapestry that connected disparate clues. Leo, with his uncanny knack for unearthing obscure historical documents, had stumbled upon independent evidence that resonated with your cryptic map. It was like finding two halves of a very old, very intriguing puzzle. The map wasn't overtly labeled Atlantis. In fact, it had no name for the mysterious island at all. But its concentric patterns, its reported location beyond the Pillars of Hercules, a classical reference to the Strait of Gibraltar, and the sheer audacity of its depiction in a time when mapping was still a rough science, all pointed to one inescapable conclusion for your ever-buzzing brain. This wasn't just a forgotten island, it was the forgotten island. The one that had haunted scholars and dreamers for millennia. Mainstream historical knowledge point alert. The story of Atlantis primarily comes from the ancient Greek philosopher Plato, specifically in his dialogues Timaeus and Critias. He describes it as a powerful naval empire that conquered many parts of Europe and Africa in ancient times but eventually attempted to invade Athens. After failing, it sank into the ocean in a single day and night of misfortunes. Now, whether Plato intended this as a literal historical account, a moral allegory, or a bit of both, is something historians are still debating to this day. Some argue it's a fictional tale to illustrate his philosophical ideas about ideal societies and the dangers of hubris. Others believe it's based on real historical events, perhaps the destruction of Minoan civilization on the island of Thera, modern-day Santorini, by a massive volcanic eruption around 1600 BCE, which did lead to a sudden collapse, but this map, this quiet, unassuming piece of paper, felt different. It wasn't philosophical allegory, it was geographical. It was a cartographer, however flawed, attempting to chart something they believed was real. It was a cold, hard piece of potential evidence, rather than a fireside tale. You and Leo became obsessed. The map became your new holy grail, a focal point for your increasingly elaborate theories. You traced its lines, compared it to geological surveys of the ocean floor, a truly fascinating rabbit hole, by the way, full of unexpected ridges and trenches, and even tried to cross-reference it with ancient astronomical charts, just in case. You knew, deep down, that you needed more than just a faded drawing. You needed a guide, someone with real academic clout, someone who could open doors to proper research facilities, someone who could translate your chaotic enthusiasm into tangible progress. You needed Professor Anya Sharma. Little did you know, convincing her was going to be an adventure in itself. Armed with your tattered map printout, Leo's obscure logbook notes, and a healthy dose of unbridled optimism, you knew your next step was clear: approach Professor Anya Sharma. Professor Sharma was, to put it mildly, a legend in her field. Her office, perpetually smelling of old paper and strong tea, was a labyrinth of archaeological finds, ancient pottery shards, and books stacked precariously high like mini Stonehenges. She had a reputation for being brilliant, meticulous, and, well, a tad bit intimidating. Her gaze, behind a pair of sensible spectacles, could dissect a flimsy argument faster than a laser pointer through butter. You remember the trepidation in your stomach as you and Leo hovered outside her office door. You clutched your map, a sweaty testament to your nervousness. Leo, ever the charmer, straightened his perpetually rumpled shirt. "All right," he whispered, "remember the strategy. Start with the data, then the theory, then the bouah factor." You nodded, trying to appear scholarly and not like you were about to pitch a fantasy novel. You walked in, and the air immediately felt heavier, thick with the weight of centuries of accumulated knowledge. Professor Sharma looked up from a delicate ancient scroll, her expression unreadable. "Yes, Leo." "And, you," she said, her eyes briefly flicking to your map. "To what do I owe this unscheduled, and frankly, rather disheveled, interruption?" Leo, bless his heart, launched into a passionate, if slightly rambling, introduction. He gestured wildly with his hands, describing the anomalous currents, the unusual depth soundings, the coincidences. You, meanwhile, carefully laid out your blurry map printout on her desk, smoothing out the creases with reverence usually reserved for sacred texts. Professor Sharma picked up the map. She held it up to the light, her brow furrowing. You held your breath. This was it. This was where your Atlantean dreams either soared or crashed into the hard, unforgiving ground of academic skeptici. Small. She traced a finger over the concentric circles, then over the faint outline of the mysterious island. A long silence stretched between you, punctuated only by the distant hum of the university's ventilation system. "You're suggesting," she began, her voice calm, almost dangerously so, "that this drawing, combined with some anecdotal shipping logs, points to the existence of a lost continent. A continent that vanished in a single night, as described by a philosopher who probably used it as a narrative device for his political treatises?" Her tone was drier than a mummy's sandal. This was the professor's skepticism in full bloom, and it was a formidable force. You tried to interject, "But Professor, the details, the consistency across different sources." She raised a hand, silencing you immediately. "My dear, the world is full of consistent details. Consistency does not equate to veracity. The story of Atlantis is a charming myth, a powerful allegory, perhaps even a distant echo of a real catastrophe, like the eruption of Thera, which did devastate the Minoan civilization. Academics have been debating for centuries whether Plato's Atlantis was purely fictional, a historical account, or a highly exaggerated retelling of a real event like Thera. But a literal, advanced continent just poofing out of existence? That's the stuff of Hollywood blockbusters, not serious archaeological inquiry. She even managed to make Hollywood blockbusters sound like a particularly nasty swear word. You felt a familiar flush creep up your neck. She wasn't wrong, of course. The direct, literal interpretation of Atlantis does sound a bit outlandish. But your gut, that persistent, nagging feeling in the back of your mind, told you there was more to it. There was a faint scent of something real beneath the layers of myth and exaggeration. Leo, however, was undeterred. He had a particular talent for persistence. But Professor, he pressed, what if it wasn't a continent? What if it was a smaller landmass? SS. And what if it didn't poof? What if it was a gradual process, misinterpreted by later generations as a sudden event? He pointed to the map. Look at the geological features around this area. It's a highly active seismic zone. Subduction zones, underwater volcanoes. It's a literal hotspot for geological drama. Professor Sharma leaned back, her gaze unwavering. You could almost see the gears turning in her brilliant mind. She was evaluating, not dismissing. This was a subtle but crucial difference. Leo, you know my work focuses on verifiable historical data, tangible archaeological remains. Legends are fascinating, yes, but they are not evidence. Unless you can show me more than a sketch and some sailor's tall tales, this remains an interesting curiosity, not a valid research proposal. But then, a flicker. A tiny, almost imperceptible shift in her expression. Her eyes returned to the map, lingering on those precise, radiating lines. Here's a quirky historical tidbit. Did you know that some early cartographers, lacking accurate surveying tools, would often include mythical islands on their maps based on sailors' tales or even just pure imagination? The famous Phantom Island of Hy-Brasil, which supposedly appeared off the coast of Ireland every 7 years, was depicted on maps for centuries. So, the existence of this mysterious island on your map wasn't, in itself, proof of Atlantis, but its unique characteristics were certainly intriguing. However, she conceded, picking up your map again, these concentric patterns, they are unusual for a natural landmass. And the location does correspond to an area with significant underwater geological activity. While I remain highly skeptical, Leo, your persistence, bordering on outright stubbornness, sometimes yields unexpected results. And your enthusiasm, she directed at you, a faint hint of a smile playing on her lips, is almost contagious. Almost, you both beamed. It wasn't a full endorsement, not by a long shot. But it was an opening. A crack in the academic fortress. Professor Sharma was willing to consider it, to give you access to the university's resources, the geological databases, the sonar mapping equipment. Provided, of course, you stuck to verifiable data and left the golden palaces and flying machines at the door. You had bought yourself a chance, a very small, very narrow chance, to prove that the whispers of Atlantis weren't just bedtime stories. You were about to trade dusty books for actual dirt, and a lot of very, very cold water. With Professor Sharma's grudging approval, a tiny crack in her academic armor, but a crack nonetheless, you and Leo felt a surge of adrenaline. It was like getting the keys to the coolest, dustiest, most historically significant toy box in the world. Your immediate mission, to find tangible evidence, something more concrete than a faded map and a few obscure logbook entries. And where better to start than the very edges of the known world, the supposed pillars of Hercules that guarded the mythical path to Atlantis. You packed your bags, filled with a strange mix of high-tech gear you barely knew how to operate and notebooks filled with frantic scribbles. Your journey was officially underway. Your first stop was a small, sun-drenched coastal town nestled along the Strait of Gibraltar. The air here was thick with the scent of salt, fish, and history. Whitewashed buildings clung to hillsides, overlooking a shimmering expanse of water that had witnessed millennia of maritime traffic. This was the ancient gateway to the Atlantic, the very spot Plato had described as the threshold to Atlantis. You and Leo spent days exploring the coastline, not with shovels and pickaxes, but with portable ground-penetrating radar units, thanks, Professor Sharma, high-resolution cameras, and a drone that, frankly, you were still trying to master without crashing it into a flock of seagulls. The locals, mostly grizzled fishermen with faces weathered by sun and sea, eyed your strange equipment with a mix of suspicion and amusement. They'd seen it all, it seemed, from eccentric tourists to genuine eccentrics. You were looking for anomalies, anything that didn't quite fit the natural geological formations. It was painstaking work. Most of the time, the radar just showed you layers of sand, rock, and the occasional buried sardine can. You felt a bit like a highly paid, utterly ineffective beachcomber. Leo, however, had an uncanny eye for the subtle. He'd point to a slight, almost imperceptible rise in the terrain, or a cluster of rocks that seemed too neatly arranged, and insist you run another scan. You'd sigh, humor him, and more often than not, find, well, nothing exciting, until, that is, the third day. You were trudging along a particularly desolate stretch of beach, the kind where the sand was coarser and littered with ancient, sun-bleached shells. The drone, which Leo was piloting with surprising dexterity that day, suddenly picked up something. A faint, geometric pattern just beneath the surface of the shallow water, close to the shore. It was too regular, too precise to be natural. Your heart gave a little thump. "Leo," you breathed, pointing at the drone's monitor. "Look at that. It's a perfect rectangle." He squinted. "Ha. Could be anything. An old foundation? A Roman bathhouse someone forgot about." You shook your head. "No, look at the size. And the way it's angled. It doesn't look like typical Roman construction. And it's too far out from anything else." You grabbed the portable ground-penetrating radar. The signals were weak, muffled by the water and the overlying sediment, but they clearly showed a structure. A large, rectangular one, with what appeared to be smaller, perpendicular lines within it, almost like an internal grid. It was buried just a few meters beneath the current waterline, meaning it had once been on dry land. This wasn't some natural rock formation. This was man-made. Academic debate time. One of the persistent challenges for archaeologists when studying coastal sites is sea level change. Over thousands of years, global sea levels have fluctuated dramatically due to glacial periods and climate shifts. Many ancient settlements that were once on coastlines are now submerged, and conversely, some areas that were once underwater are now dry land. This constant shift means that finding coastal clues requires understanding not just what you're looking at, but when the landmass was at a certain elevation relative to the ocean. Historians and geologists are still debating the precise impact of these changes on specific ancient sites. It makes finding things tricky, like trying to find your keys in a house that keeps flooding and draining. This discovery, while not a golden Atlantean temple, was significant. It wasn't just a structure, it was anomalous. It suggested a larger settlement, something built and then abandoned, or perhaps submerged. It was a tangible link to a time when this coastline was different, when human activity extended further out into what was now the shallow sea. You carefully marked the coordinates, took dozens of photographs, and felt a thrill that was both intellectual and deeply, unexpectedly personal. That evening, you emailed Professor Sharma the data. You tried to sound casual, professional, like you hadn't just spent 3 days wading through knee-deep water wrestling with a reluctant drone. Her reply was succinct, intriguing. Follow up with sonar mapping of the immediate offshore area. Do not damage university equipment. Not exactly a cheerleader, but it was progress. More than progress, it was an invitation to dive deeper, literally. The coastline had given up a hint, a mere breadcrumb. The real secrets, you knew, lay further out, beneath the waves, where the ocean had been silently guarding its history for millennia. You were about to get wet, and probably very cold. Professor Sharma's succinct intriguing was the academic equivalent of a standing ovation. For you, it was a green light, an almost sacred blessing to proceed. The next phase of your Atlantean quest was clear, underwater. You were about to trade sandy beaches for the silent, shimmering world beneath the surface, a realm where light fractured into dancing patterns and secrets lay buried under millennia of sediment. Your slightly awkward ground-penetrating radar beach strolls were over. It was time for the really cool toys. The university's oceanography department, thanks to Professor Sharma's influence, was surprisingly well-equipped. You found yourself surrounded by blinking screens, sonar equipment that looked like something out of a spy movie, and a serious-looking, remotely operated underwater vehicle, ROV, affectionately nicknamed Nemo. Nemo, with its multiple thrusters, powerful lights, and high-definition cameras, was your new best friend. You, however, were still primarily the designated coffee maker and data logger, while Leo, surprisingly, took to the ROV controls with the natural ease of a seasoned gamer. Your target area was the offshore region directly in line with the puzzling rectangular structure you'd found near the coast. The idea was simple, at least in theory: map the seafloor, identify any anomalies, and hope for something that screamed ancient civilization, rather than really big rock. The reality, as you quickly discovered, was a lot more tedious. Hours blurred into days as you stared at sonar readouts, watching squiggly lines resolve into vaguely undulating terrain. The ocean floor, you learned, was surprisingly featureless in many places, a vast, sandy desert punctuated by occasional rocky outcrops. It was like watching paint dry, if the paint was thousands of feet underwater and potentially hiding the greatest archaeological discovery in history. No pressure, then, just as your eyelids were beginning to droop and your brain was contemplating the profound mysteries of why instant coffee tasted vaguely of despair, something appeared on the screen. It wasn't the dramatic outline of a city, or even a crumbling temple. It was much subtler. A series of faint, almost imperceptible lines, perfectly straight, running parallel to each other. Too straight to be natural. Too regular to be random. Whoa, hold on, you mumbled, leaning closer to the screen, suddenly wide awake. Leo, rewind that. Zoom in. Leo, who had been meticulously piloting Nemo through a virtual underwater trench, complied. The lines resolved further. They weren't just parallel, they intersected at precise angles, forming what looked like the ghost of a grid. And connecting these lines were faint, circular depressions, almost like post holes. Or foundations. Your heart hammered against your ribs. This wasn't a single, isolated rectangle. This was a pattern. A widespread, intelligent design stretching across the seabed. It was like seeing the blueprint of a forgotten city etched into the ocean floor, visible only through the technological wizardry of sonar. Here's a cool, slightly unsettling fact: the deepest parts of the ocean, like the Mariana Trench, are still less explored than the surface of Mars. We know more about the moon than we do about our own planet's abyssal plains. So, the idea of vast, undiscovered features or even submerged ancient sites lurking in the deep isn't as far-fetched as it might sound. The pressure down there is immense, making direct human exploration incredibly challenging, which is why ROVs like your trusty Nemo are invaluable. Professor Sharma, who had been making her own discreet observations from a corner of the control room, slowly approached the screen. Her expression remained impassive, but you could sense a subtle shift in the air, a crackle of focused intensity. She pointed a laser pointer at one of the circular anomalies. These depressions, what are your readings for them? Leo pulled up the data. Consistent depth, Co. Consistent diameter, Professor. And the sediment analysis suggests they're not natural erosion. The surrounding substrate shows signs of human alteration, possibly even ancient tool marks, though it's hard to be certain from the sonar. This was it. This was the moment. Professor, you ventured, trying to keep your voice steady, this looks like a foundation. A very large, very old foundation. For something structured, something organized. You imagined massive buildings rising from these ghostly outlines, a city born from the very rock of the seabed, before its eventual, dramatic slumber. She nodded slowly, a rare gesture of agreement. It certainly suggests human activity. Significant human activity. But what kind of activity, and when, remains to be seen. It's not a temple, and it's certainly not a golden palace. It looks more like a planned settlement. Perhaps a harbor, or a complex of docks. Her eyes, usually so critical, now held a spark of genuine curiosity. The depth indicates it would have been dry land during a much earlier period of lower sea levels. This aligns with certain geological models of past ice ages, mainstream historical knowledge point. During the last glacial maximum, which peaked around 20,000 years ago, global sea levels were significantly lower, by as much as 120 meters, nearly 400 feet. Because so much water was locked up in massive ice sheets. This means that coastlines were vastly different from what they are today, and many areas that are now submerged were once exposed land, potentially home to early human settlements. As the ice melted, these areas were gradually inundated. This makes the idea of ancient, coastal settlements now lying underwater entirely plausible. This wasn't the dramatic discovery of a fully preserved Atlantean city, no, but it was something arguably more profound. It was a tangible imprint of a lost world, a whisper made solid. The underwater echoes weren't just vague signals, they were starting to paint a picture. You're a fascinating, if still very blurry, picture of something massive and man-made beneath the waves. You weren't just chasing a myth anymore, you were mapping a ghost. And the chase was about to get even more exciting, because you knew, deep down, that Nemo was just scratching the surface. The sonar data, those ghostly grids etched onto the seabed, had lit a fire under Professor Sharma. Her skepticism hadn't vanished entirely, it had simply mutated into a highly focused, intensely academic curiosity. She was now on board, not with the Atlantis myth, but with the undeniable fact that something significant lay beneath the waves in that precise location. This meant bigger boats, better equipment, and, most importantly, actual divers. Your caffeine consumption, already legendary, was about to reach truly epic proportions. The next phase involved deploying an advanced deep-sea imaging system and, eventually, a small team of specialized archaeological divers. You and Leo were, of course, part of the surface support crew, glued to the monitors, our hearts thumping with every new image that flickered onto the screen. The initial images confirmed what the sonar had hinted at. There were indeed massive, cut stone blocks down there, lying in orderly rows, partially covered by centuries of sediment. They weren't naturally occurring. These were clearly part of a massive construction project. Then came the first diver's report, relayed excitedly over the comms. "Professor, we've got, it looks like a wall. A very, very thick wall. And there are carvings, faint, but definitely there." Your breath hitched. Carvings? You instantly pictured ornate Atlantean script, stories of golden ages and wise rulers. Professor Sharma, however, was far more pragmatic. "Don't speculate, Jenkins," she snapped over the comms, though you could detect a tremor of excitement in her voice. "Just describe what you see. Take detailed photographs. Retrieve any small, portable objects that are not structurally integral." The hours that followed were a blur of tension and exhilaration. The divers carefully cleared away sediment, revealing more and more of the submerged structures. It wasn't the fantastical, perfectly preserved city of legend. It was a ruin, a colossal, ancient ruin, weathered by millennia of currents and time. But it was undeniably there. Massive stone blocks, clearly shaped by human hands, formed what looked like foundations, roads, and perhaps even harbors. The concentric patterns from your old map were starting to take solid, albeit ruined, form. Then came the first artifact. Not a glittering jewel or a futuristic device, but something far more mundane, yet infinitely more powerful in its implications, a pottery shard. It was brought up carefully, placed in a special container, and rushed to a makeshift lab on the ship. Professor Sharma handled it with the reverence usually reserved for royal crowns. It was crude, unornamented, but undeniably man-made and very, very old. Here's a fascinating, if slightly grim, fact: many ancient civilizations, especially those near active volcanic regions or unstable coastlines, were skilled at building with stone because it was durable and readily available. However, even the most robust stone structures are vulnerable to relentless natural forces like erosion, seismic activity, and the corrosive power of saltwater. So, finding weathered, submerged stone isn't unusual, but the pattern and scale of it, as you were discovering, was truly exceptional. The next day brought more finds. Not just pottery, but tools. Simple stone tools, similar to those used by early human civilizations, but with slight variations in design that hinted at unique local methods. There were also remnants of what appeared to be primitive fishing weights, made of naturally shaped stones with grooves for lines. It was a cold, hard dose of reality that this wasn't a hyper-advanced, technologically superior society. These were people, using the materials available to them, living lives that were perhaps not so different from other early coastal communities. But then, an object was brought up that defied easy categorization. It was a disc, about the size of your palm, made of a dark, obsidian-like material. It was smooth, highly polished, and had intricate, swirling patterns etched into its surface. It didn't look like a tool. It didn't look like a weapon. It looked ceremonial. Or perhaps, decorative. Professor Sharma ran her gloved finger over the patterns. Interesting, she murmured. The material is volcanic glass, common in many ancient cultures near seismic areas. But these markings, they don't correspond to any known ancient script I've encountered. Not Minoan, not Mycenaean, not early Phoenician. This was a rare admission for her, a tacit acknowledgement of the unknown. A quirky archaeological tidbit. Sometimes, archaeologists find out-of-place artifacts, objects whose technology or design seems to predate the established timeline or known capabilities of the culture they are found in. These often spark intense debate and sometimes lead to the re-evaluation of historical timelines. However, most often, they turn out to be misinterpreted, misdated, or simply unique local innovations that don't fit neatly into broader historical categories. So, while your obsidian disc was intriguing, Professor Sharma was instinctively cautious. The disc wasn't futuristic, but it wasn't primitive either. It was distinctly unique. It suggested a culture with its own artistic and possibly symbolic language, a society that had developed in isolation, or at least with very limited external influence. It hinted at a deep history that had unfolded on this now submerged land. You felt a wave of profound awe wash over you. This wasn't the Atlantis of the myths, not yet. But it was something real, something tangible, something that whispered of human ingenuity and resilience in the face of colossal natural forces. These were not mythical beings, these were people, their lives now reduced to silent stones and enigmatic artifacts. You were no longer just chasing a legend, you were unearthing a lost history, piece by painstaking piece, from the silent depths of the ocean. And the more you found, the more you realized that the story of Atlantis was far more complex, and perhaps, far more tragic, than any myth could convey. The discovery of the obsidian disc and the intricate stone structures had shifted Professor Sharma's focus from mere academic interest to full-blown investigative zeal. The ship's deck, once a quiet hub of specialized technicians, now buzzed with a frenetic energy. Data streamed in continuously from the ROV and the divers, filling screens with images of ancient walls, strange depressions, and intriguing geological formations. You were no longer just an enthusiastic observer, you were neck-deep in the data, cross-referencing sonar readings with visual surveys, trying to piece together the grand puzzle. Then, it happened. Not a dramatic explosion, or a sudden, catastrophic collapse, but something far more insidious and, in its own way, terrifying, a tremor. It started as a subtle vibration, a low hum that ran through the ship's hull, escalating quickly into a noticeable shake. Bottles clinked in the galley, loose papers rattled across desks, and the screens displaying the underwater feed momentarily flickered and distorted. Earthquake. Someone shouted, stating the obvious with a hint of panic. Professor Sharma, surprisingly calm, immediately barked orders. Secure all equipment. Check on the divers. Get me a geological readout. Now, you watched in horrified fascination as the underwater cameras showed a terrifying ballet of destruction. Sediment plumes billowed upwards from the seabed, obscuring the ancient structures. Cracks, like lightning bolts, spiderwebbed across what had been solid rock. Sections of the submerged walls, painstakingly revealed just hours before, groaned and shifted, some crumbling into clouds of debris. It was a stark, brutal reminder of the immense, untamed power of the earth. Within minutes, the main tremor subsided, leaving behind a profound, unsettling silence. The ship still rocked gently from the aftershocks, but the immediate danger had passed. The divers were safe, thankfully, having surfaced as soon as the tremors began. But the damage to the site, the very place you were trying to understand, was evident. The once clear images were now blurry with stirred-up silt, and new fissures marred the ancient landscape. Professor Sharma was already poring over the seismic data. Her eyes, usually so sharp, were wide with a grim understanding. Well, she stated, her voice tight, that was informative. Right on cue, it seems. She pointed to a glowing red line on a geological map. This entire region is a very active seismic zone. We're sitting directly on a major fault line. This wasn't a random event, it's just what this part of the world does. Mainstream geological knowledge alert. The Earth's crust is not a single, solid shell but is broken into several large pieces called tectonic plates. These plates are constantly moving, albeit very slowly, driven by convection currents in the Earth's mantle. Where these plates meet, they can either pull apart, divergent boundaries, slide past each other, transform boundaries, or collide, convergent boundaries. The interactions at these plate boundaries are responsible for most of the world's earthquakes, volcanic activity, and mountain building. The region around the Strait of Gibraltar, for instance, is influenced by the complex boundary between the African and Eurasian plates, making it highly susceptible to seismic events. This is why you feel that tremor. The tremor, while destructive, had also, paradoxically, revealed something new. As the silt settled, the underwater cameras picked up fresh collapses, exposing layers of rock that had been hidden for millennia. And within those newly exposed layers, there were distinct, layered deposits of ash and volcanic rock. Not just small scattered bits, but thick, discernible strata. Volcanic ash, Leo murmured, his voice hushed. Lots of it, Professor Sharma nodded slowly. Precisely. Not just one event, either. These layers suggest multiple, significant volcanic eruptions over a prolonged period. This particular tremor likely triggered localized collapses, but the underlying geological processes have been at work for a very, very long time. A cold, hard, slightly unsettling fact, the geological record is like a vast, unwritten history book, with each layer of rock telling a story. Volcanic eruptions, especially large ones, deposit layers of ash and pumice that can cover vast areas, preserving a snapshot of that moment in time. These layers can then be dated, allowing geologists and archaeologists to reconstruct past environmental conditions and potential cataclysmic events. Finding multiple ash layers suggests a history of recurrent volcanic activity in the area. This wasn't just a single day and night of misfortunes that Plato had described. This was a long, geological saga. The land you were exploring, now submerged, was not only prone to earthquakes but also to volcanic activity. It was living on geological borrowed time, constantly under threat from the forces shaping the very planet. You looked at the screen, at the still turbulent waters and the crumbling ancient structures. The myth of Atlantis depicted a sudden, dramatic disappearance. But what if the disaster wasn't a single, explosive event, but a series of relentless, grinding blows from nature? What if the land had been slowly, inexorably pulled apart, shaken, and buried by ash, only for the final, fatal blow to be dealt by rising waters? Professor, you said, your voice barely above a whisper, what if it wasn't a sudden sinking? What if this land, what if it was being pulled apart, slowly, for a long time, by these earthquakes and eruptions? And the disappearance was just the final, visible stage. She looked at you, a flicker of something almost like respect in her eyes. That, she said, tapping a finger on the seismic map, is a very sound geological hypothesis. And it aligns far better with the evidence we are seeing here than any sudden, mythical catastrophe. Academics are still debating the precise mechanisms of ancient landmass change. But tectonic activity and volcanism are certainly prime suspects. It's a bit like watching a very slow-motion demolition, isn't it? Only on a continental scale, the tremor, a terrifying interruption, had, in fact, given you a crucial piece of the puzzle. It wasn't just about what was there, but how it got there, and why it was no longer there. The earth itself was speaking, groaning under the immense forces that had shaped, and ultimately swallowed, a civilization. And you were finally beginning to understand its chilling, protracted story. The seismic event, terrifying as it was, had cracked open a new chapter in your understanding of the submerged ruins. It wasn't just about what you were finding, but how it got there. The story of Atlantis was evolving from a sudden, mythical catastrophe into a slow, grinding geological drama. Yet, for all your high-tech gadgets and scientific data, something felt missing. You were looking at rocks and numbers, but not at people. Who were these Atlanteans? How did they live on such a geologically volatile stage? Professor Sharma, ever the pragmatist, agreed. Data is crucial, she'd said, but context is king. We need to understand the human element, if one ever existed here beyond these stones. And so, your next step was to return to the human touchstone you'd briefly encountered earlier, the local wisdom. You and Leo found yourselves back in that small, sun-drenched coastal town, but this time, your mission was less about scanning the seabed and more about listening to the whispers of generations. The fishermen, with their tanned, weathered faces and eyes that seemed to hold the secrets of the deep, were your primary targets. They spent their lives on the water, knew its moods, its dangers, and its occasional gifts. You started in the village square, a sleepy hub where old men mended nets and women haggled over the day's catch. You and Leo, looking distinctly out of place with your city clothes and earnest expressions, felt a bit like anthropologists on a foreign planet. Leo, with his easy charm, struck up a conversation with an elderly fisherman named Matteo, whose laugh lines crinkled around eyes as blue as the deepest ocean. The university folk, Matteo chuckled, eyeing your notebook. Still looking for your sunken cities, eh? Many have come before you, with their fancy machines. The sea keeps her secrets well. We're just trying to understand the history of this region, Matteo, you explained, trying to sound genuinely humble. We found some very old structures out there. Beneath the waves. They look man-made. Do your people have any stories, any old legends about land that once was? Matteo paused, puffing on an ancient pipe. Stories? Oh, we have many stories. My great-grandfather, he used to say the sea was once a hungry beast, always trying to swallow the land. He spoke of an old village, further out than ours, that slowly, slipped beneath the waves. Not in a great storm, mind you, but little by little, over many lifetimes. This was exactly what you needed to hear. Not a sudden, dramatic disappearance, but a gradual, creeping inundation. It aligned perfectly with the geological evidence of slow subsidence and rising sea levels, mainstream historical knowledge point. Oral traditions and folklore can be invaluable resources for archaeologists and historians, especially in cultures where written records are scarce or non-existent. While often embellished or distorted over time, these stories can contain kernels of historical truth, reflecting real events like migrations, natural disasters, or the founding of settlements. For example, many indigenous cultures have oral histories that accurately describe geological events that occurred thousands of years ago, like volcanic eruptions or tsunamis. This is why listening to local accounts is so vital. Mateo then introduced you to the village elders, a small council of ancient wisdom keepers who gathered in the shade of a gnarled olive tree. Their faces were maps of time, etched with every sunrise and sunset. You told them about the submerged structures, the strange disk, the layers of volcanic ash you'd found. You showed them the grainy photos from Nemo, and their eyes, surprisingly sharp, seemed to see more than just blurred pixels. One elder, an ancient woman named Elena, whose voice was like the rustling of dry leaves, spoke softly. Our ancestors, they lived closer to the great water than we do now. The stories say they had houses built right upon the edge, almost in the sea itself. And when the earth shook, or the big smoke came from the mountain, the water would rise a little more. Each time, they would move further inland. They understood. The sea was not always their friend. A cold, hard fact from historical archaeology: many ancient coastal communities developed sophisticated methods for adapting to their environment, including building on stilts, creating artificial islands, or developing flood-resistant architecture. However, even the most resilient communities could be overwhelmed by sustained environmental pressures. The subtle shift from a land-based existence to a more maritime one, or the gradual abandonment of coastal settlements, would leave very different archaeological traces than a sudden cataclysm. This is why you weren't finding perfectly preserved palaces, but rather foundations and scattered artifacts. She then recounted a quirky local legend, not about a magnificent, lost city, but about a stone-hearted giant who lived beneath the waves. When the giant was angry, he would gnaw at the land, making it crumble and sink, piece by piece. When he sighed, the sea would creep higher, slowly covering everything. It was a personification of the very geological processes you were observing: tectonic plate movement and sea level rise. For them, it wasn't abstract science, it was the giant beneath their feet. Academics are still debating the extent to which myths and legends reflect historical reality versus serving as allegories or purely fictional narratives. Some scholars argue that the memory of a large-scale disaster can be preserved in oral traditions for remarkably long periods, even millennia, though the details may become increasingly fantastical. Others believe that such stories are primarily cultural constructs, reflecting human anxieties about the natural world rather than specific historical events. This wasn't Plato's Atlantis, not exactly. It was something far more poignant. It was the story of people, your imagined Atlanteans, who lived with the constant, creeping threat of their world dissolving beneath them. They weren't powerful, arrogant conquerors suddenly struck down by divine wrath. They were survivors, making do, moving inland, adapting, until one day, there was no more land to move to, or the cost became too great. Their wisdom wasn't about grand architectural feats, but about reading the signs of a restless earth and a rising sea. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues. You felt a profound connection to these people, both the living and the long gone. The elders' stories filled in the human gaps in your scientific data, giving voice to the silent stones. The story of Atlantis was becoming less about a lost city and more about a lost way of life, a slow, inevitable farewell to a sinking homeland. You now had the scientific evidence of how the land changed, and the oral history of how the people reacted. The next piece of the puzzle was to understand the specific natural forces at play. The village elders' stories, echoing through the generations, had given a hauntingly human dimension to the raw geological data. You were no longer just looking at a sunken landmass, you were seeing the faint outlines of homes, fields, and lives that had slowly, inexorably, surrendered to the sea. The stone-hearted giant and his gnawing at the land resonated deeply with the seismic tremors you'd experienced and the volcanic ash layers you'd uncovered. It was time to put a name to these monstrous forces. Back on the research vessel, the atmosphere was less frantic than during the tremor, but more intensely focused. Professor Sharma was now fully invested, driven by the compelling narrative forming between the scientific data and the oral histories. Your job, among many others, was to delve deeper into the specific geological culprits, volcanism and tsunamis. You spent hours with Leo in front of geological survey maps, looking at the entire region. The Strait of Gibraltar, the nearby Atlantic, the very area where your mysterious map had placed its submerged island, it was all a complex dance of tectonic plates. You were sitting on the edge of the African and Eurasian plates, which were constantly grinding against each other. This wasn't a gentle waltz, it was a slow, brutal tango. Mainstream geological knowledge alert. The Ring of Fire gets all the press for its volcanoes and earthquakes, but the Mediterranean region is also incredibly active due to the complex collision zones of several tectonic plates. Volcanic islands like Santorini, Thera, Stromboli, and Mount Etna are all testaments to this ongoing geological drama. The very same forces that uplift mountains can also cause land to subside, and they certainly cause a lot of earthquakes. See here, Professor Sharma pointed to a particular spot on the map, a cluster of underwater mountains. These are submarine volcanoes. Some are dormant, some are active. And we've detected evidence of significant past eruptions from his very cluster, particularly a series of large, explosive events thousands of years ago. The ash layers you found? They matched the composition of these volcanoes. This was it. This was the mechanism. Not just a single volcano, but a persistent threat, slowly burying and destabilizing the land. Imagine living on an island that periodically coughed out ash, covering your fields, polluting your water, and making the very ground beneath your feet rumble. It would be a constant, low-level dread, punctuated by terrifying, explosive events. Here's a quirky geological tidbit. Did you know that some deep-sea volcanoes, called hydrothermal vents, create entire ecosystems that thrive without sunlight, powered by chemicals spewing from the Earth's interior? These alien-like environments are home to bizarre creatures like giant tube worms and blind shrimp. So, while you were focused on the destructive power of volcanoes, some of them are also busy creating life in the most unexpected places. The Earth, truly, is full of surprises, but volcanoes weren't the only threat. And then there's the tsunami factor, Leo added, pointing to another section of the map where a fault line ran directly beneath the ocean floor. A major earthquake along this fault, especially a powerful underwater one, could generate a massive tsunami. A series of them, even, over time. You pictured it, a wall of water, towering over the land, sweeping everything before it. The elders' stories of the sea creeping higher and the hungry beast trying to swallow the land suddenly took on a terrifying new meaning. A tsunami wouldn't just flood the land, it would scour it, eroding soil, destroying structures, and dragging entire villages out to sea. And crucially, if the land was already subsiding from seismic activity and weighed down by volcanic ash, it would be even more vulnerable. Many academics are still debating the precise role of tsunamis in the final destruction of ancient coastal civilizations. Professor Sharma noted, ever the purist. While seismic events are well documented, distinguishing between the effects of a direct earthquake and a subsequent tsunami in the archaeological record can be challenging. However, the evidence from coastal sites worldwide suggests that tsunamis have been a significant, recurring threat throughout human history. The leading theory for the demise of the Minoan civilization on Thera, for example, is a massive volcanic eruption followed by a devastating tsunami. It's a compelling parallel. Plato's description of Atlantis sinking in a single day and night suddenly sounded less like divine wrath and more like the immediate, overwhelming aftermath of a powerful earthquake combined with a colossal tsunami, perhaps triggered by a volcanic collapse. The day and night could be the dramatic culmination of centuries of slow, geological torment. You imagine the Atlanteans, not as technologically advanced super beings, but as ordinary people, perhaps more resilient and resourceful than most. They would have built their homes, cultivated their fields, and lived their lives with the constant awareness of the rumbling earth and the unpredictable sea. They would have developed their own ways of coping, their own legends to explain the terrifying forces that shaped their world. They might have even developed some advanced understanding of geology, allowing them to predict or mitigate some disasters, perhaps even evacuate when necessary, leading to the legend of their wisdom. The picture that was emerging was one of a civilization living on the edge, quite literally. They weren't destroyed by divine punishment, but by the relentless, indifferent forces of nature. The Golden Age might have been their ingenuity in adapting to such a perilous environment, and their fall wasn't a moral failing, but a geological inevitability. The sheer scale and persistence of the volcanic activity and the constant threat of seismic events and tsunamis made the very existence of such a sophisticated settlement a testament to human resilience. But even resilience has its limits. The understanding of the region's intense seismic and volcanic activity painted a vivid, if grim, picture. It was less about a single, cataclysmic event and more about a relentless geological assault. But there was another, equally insidious force at play, one that didn't explode or shake, but rather crept in slowly, silently, and inexorably: climate change and its effect on sea levels. This wasn't the dramatic punch, but the slow, suffocating squeeze. Back on the ship, Professor Sharma laid out a series of paleoclimate charts. They looked like abstract art to you at first, all squiggly lines and shaded zones, but as she explained them, a chilling story began to unfold. These charts mapped global temperatures and sea levels over tens of thousands of years. And they told a tale of dramatic shifts, long before human industry entered the picture. During the last glacial period, she explained, pointing to a dip on a chart, massive ice sheets covered much of the northern hemisphere. All that water was locked up in ice, meaning global sea levels were significantly lower than they are today. We're talking hundreds of feet lower. She then traced a finger upwards along a rising curve. But then, as the earth slowly warmed, these ice sheets began to melt. And the water, quite simply, had to go somewhere. You saw it then. The slow, relentless march of the ocean. The land where your Atlanteans had lived, which was once dry and perhaps even fertile, was now slowly being reclaimed by the sea. It wasn't just a sudden flood, it was a creeping tide, year after year, generation after generation. Mainstream climate knowledge point. Earth's climate has always fluctuated naturally, experiencing cycles of glacial periods, ice ages, and interglacial periods, warmer times, like today. These natural climate cycles are driven by factors like variations in Earth's orbit around the Sun, Milankovitch cycles, volcanic activity, and changes in ocean currents. These natural shifts have profoundly impacted sea levels, coastlines, and ecosystems throughout history, long before human-induced climate change became a concern. Imagine being an Atlantean farmer. One year, your fields stretch a certain distance towards the shore. A generation later, they're a little closer to the water. Another generation, and the salt marsh has encroached further. The fresh water supply is a bit more brackish. It's not an immediate disaster you can run from, it's a slow erosion of your very way of life. The coastlines would have constantly shifted, forcing communities to adapt or retreat. The archaeological evidence from many ancient coastal sites worldwide, Professor Sharma continued, shows precisely this. Settlements that were once thriving ports are now submerged. Others, initially inland, became coastal over time. Academics are still debating the precise rate and regional variations of ancient sea level rise, as local geological factors can also play a role, but the overall trend is clear. The very gradualness of it made it even more poignant. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic punch. It was a slow strangulation. You could almost feel the water inching higher, one tide at a time, claiming a little bit more land with each passing season. The legends of a land that slipped away made perfect sense in this context. It wasn't a sinkhole, it was the ocean slowly, patiently, pulling back its watery blanket from the land, only to cover it again. Here's a quirky historical anecdote related to sea levels. Many ancient myths and flood stories from diverse cultures around the world might actually be distant echoes of real, localized sea level rise events or massive tsunamis. For instance, Some theories suggest that the Great Flood narratives in many cultures could be linked to the rapid sea level rise that occurred at the end of the last ice age, when vast continental shelves were inundated, forcing human populations to migrate. It's a reminder that sometimes, the fantastical is merely a distorted memo. Of the truly extraordinary, the constant tremors would have shaken the foundations, literally, and made the ground less stable. The volcanic ash would have blanketed the fields, making farming harder and adding weight to the already subsiding land. And then, the rising sea levels would have delivered the final, undeniable blow, slowly pushing the inhabitants further and further inland, until there was nowhere left to go. The wisdom of the Atlanteans, often mythologized as advanced technology, could simply have been their profound understanding of their volatile environment. Perhaps they were expert engineers in building flexible structures, or master mariners who adapted to a constantly changing coastline. Their power might have been their resilience, their ability to persist against overwhelming natural odds for centuries. You pictured these people, watching their ancestral lands disappear under the waves. Imagine the generational memory. Grandpa said our village used to be where that reef is now. My great-great-grandmother talked about walking to the island that's now a mere sandbar. It was a slow, agonizing loss, not a sudden, clean break. The artifacts you found, the basic tools, the fishing weights, the utilitarian stone blocks, all fit this narrative of a people adapting to a challenging, evolving environment. They weren't building grand, permanent monuments in a place they knew was slowly dying. They were surviving, thriving even, in a world that was constantly shifting beneath their feet and rising around them. The once thriving coastal areas would have been gradually abandoned, their structures slowly consumed by the waves, leaving behind only the most resilient foundations, like the ones you were now mapping. The loss of Atlantis, therefore, wasn't a sudden judgment, but the culmination of millennia of relentless natural processes. It was a testament to the power of the earth, both destructive and transformative. And for the inhabitants, it was a long, out goodbye to their homeland, a fading memory captured in the whispers of the wind and the ceaseless murmur of the sea. You were beginning to see the full, complex tapestry of their story, woven with threads of geological force and human resilience. The relentless march of sea level rise and the constant geological turmoil painted a picture of a civilization living on borrowed time. It wasn't about a sudden, dramatic sinking, but a slow, agonizing erosion of existence. This shifted your focus from the cataclysm to the mundane. What was daily life like for these people, the Atlanteans who grappled with a vanishing homeland? How did they manage to simply live when their world was literally falling apart, or rather, sinking away? You imagined their mornings. Not the serene, picturesque dawns often depicted in mythical tales, but perhaps a wary glance towards the horizon. Were the tides a little higher today? Had the ocean claimed another meter of beach overnight? The structures you found, the robust stone foundations, the seemingly practical layout, suggested a society focused on resilience, on building to last, or at least to withstand the inevitable. Their agriculture, if they had any, would have been constantly threatened. Coastal lands are often fertile, but with rising salinity and frequent inundations, maintaining crops would have been a monumental struggle. Perhaps they developed innovative irrigation systems to flush salt from the soil, or cultivated salt-tolerant crops. Academic discussions are still debating the agricultural practices of ancient coastal societies facing environmental pressures, but adaptation and diversification were often key. You pictured them tilling fields that were slowly turning brackish, moving their farms further inland with each passing generation, always just ahead of the creeping tide. Their fresh water supply would have been another critical concern. Islands, especially those prone to geological instability, often have limited access to fresh groundwater. Saltwater intrusion into aquifers, exacerbated by rising sea levels, would have made this an increasingly dire problem. Maybe they developed sophisticated rainwater harvesting systems, or discovered underground springs further inland. Every drop would have been precious, a stark contrast to the abundant, flowing rivers imagined in the myths. Here's a quirky historical anecdote. Some ancient civilizations, facing water scarcity, developed incredible engineering feats. The Nazca people of Peru, for example, built an intricate system of underground aqueducts called puquios to access groundwater in their desert environment. These were remarkably sophisticated for their time, showing how human ingenuity can rise to meet extreme environmental challenges. Perhaps your Atlanteans had similar, now submerged, innovations. Their dwellings, if the stone foundations were any indication, were likely sturdy, designed to withstand tremors and possibly even high tides. They wouldn't have built flimsy huts on such an unstable land. You imagined homes with elevated floors, or even simple, single-story structures that could be easily rebuilt or abandoned when the water came. Life would have revolved around the rhythm of the sea and the unpredictable tremors of the earth, mainstream archaeological knowledge point. When archaeologists excavate ancient sites, they don't just look for grand temples, they also seek out evidence of daily life, tools, pottery, food remains, and the layouts of homes. These mundane artifacts can tell us far more about how ordinary people lived, adapted, and survived than monumental structures. The very absence of large, ostentatious buildings in the submerged ruins you were finding further suggested a society focused on practicality and survival, rather than lavish display. The strange obsidian disc you found earlier now seemed to make more sense. Perhaps it wasn't a piece of futuristic technology, but a ceremonial object, a focal point for rituals to appease the stone-hearted giant or to seek protection from the rising waters. Or maybe it was a navigation tool, polished to reflect the stars, helping them navigate a constantly changing coastline. The lives of these people would have been deeply intertwined with their environment, their culture shaped by its challenges. Their economy would have been largely maritime. Fishing, naturally, would be paramount. They might have been exceptional boat builders, mastering the art of navigating treacherous currents and unstable shorelines. The fishing weights you found hinted at a developed fishing culture, essential for survival on a shrinking landmass. They wouldn't have been global conquerors, as Plato suggested, but perhaps skilled traders, navigating their way through a watery world. You pictured children playing on shores that no longer existed, elders recounting tales of land they remembered walking on, now deep beneath the waves. Every generation would have watched their world shrink, their horizons change. This wasn't a sudden, cataclysmic end, it was a slow, generational retreat. Their knowledge might have been the hard-won lessons of living in perpetual geological flux, their power the strength to endure, to adapt, and to cherish what little dry land they still had. The realization settled over you with a profound sense of melancholy. The dramatic myth of Atlantis painted a picture of hubris punished. But the reality, as you were piecing it together, was far more mundane, and far more tragic in its slow inevitability. These were ordinary people, facing extraordinary environmental challenges, trying to carve out a life on a land that was quite literally being pulled out from under them. Their daily struggles, their quiet resilience, were the real story. And that story, etched in stone and whispered through generations, was slowly revealing itself, not with a bang, but with a quiet, heartbreaking whimper of slow loss. You had unearthed the geological forces, listened to the human echoes, and glimpsed the daily grind of a people living on a disappearing land. The picture forming was starkly different from the mythical grand finale. This wasn't a sudden, dramatic sinking, but a slow, agonizing slide into the deep. The story of Atlantis, as you were piecing it together, was one of a gradual goodbye. Imagine standing on the shore, watching the familiar landmarks slowly disappear. First, the outermost fishing grounds become too shallow to navigate. Then, the little cove where children played is permanently submerged. A generation later, the lower fields are always damp, turning marshy, then saltwater filled. It wasn't a single, terrifying flood, but a relentless, creeping encroachment. The ocean, like a patient, silent predator, simply kept gaining ground. The geological evidence you and Professor Sharma had amassed strongly supported this. The layers of sediment over the submerged structures weren't indicative of a single, massive displacement, but rather of slow accumulation over vast stretches of time. The very structures themselves, while robust, showed signs of prolonged exposure to the elements, not immediate burial. They were weathered, not shattered. Mainstream geological knowledge point. Geologists often use sedimentary layering and the degree of erosion on submerged structures to determine the timeline and nature of their submergence. A rapid, catastrophic event would leave distinct signs of violent displacement, like widespread debris fields or fractured, unweathered surfaces. A gradual submergence, however, results in more uniform sediment deposition and significant wear from currents and marine life over thousands of years. Exactly what you were seeing, the day and night of misfortunes described by Plato likely represents the culmination of this long, drawn-out process, or perhaps the final, most dramatic event in a series of smaller disasters. Maybe it was a particularly severe earthquake and tsunami that delivered the final, visible blow, but by then, the civilization was already in decline, weakened by centuries of environmental pressure. It was like the final push that toppled a building already riddled with cracks. Think about what this means for the people. They weren't caught entirely by surprise. Their elders, their myths, their very way of life would have ingrained the knowledge that their land was ephemeral. They would have developed strategies for retreat, for adaptation. Perhaps they had multiple settlements, moving inland as the coastal ones became uninhabitable. The core of their civilization might have shifted, like a hermit crab finding a new shell, gradually abandoning the most vulnerable areas. Here's a poignant archaeological reflection. When archaeologists find evidence of gradual abandonment, it often speaks volumes about human resilience and foresight. Unlike catastrophic events that leave behind Pompeii-style time capsules, slow environmental changes lead to the orderly, or sometimes desperate, removal of valuables and a gradual decline in population. It suggests a conscious decision to leave, rather than a sudden, forced end. This is why you weren't finding gold dinner plates still on tables, but rather practical tools and the remnants of basic infrastructure. The legends of Atlantean power and advancement could be interpreted not as literal technological superiority, but as their remarkable ability to sustain a complex society in such a challenging environment for an extended period. Their wisdom was in their understanding of the natural world, their resilience in the face of its relentless changes. They were not defeated by hubris, but overwhelmed by the slow, inexorable forces of nature. Academics are still debating the precise extent to which ancient societies were aware of and reacted to long-term environmental changes like sea level rise. While they lacked modern scientific instruments, their survival depended on acute observation of their surroundings. Their oral histories and building practices suggest a deep, experiential knowledge of their dynamic environment, far more nuanced than what written records alone might convey. You could almost hear the conversations between generations. Remember, son, the old stories say this very spot used to be dry land. Our ancestors built these walls strong because they knew the sea would always test them. It was a continuous narrative of retreat and adaptation, a slow dance with the encroaching waves. The city, or what was left of it, didn't vanish in a blaze of glory. It faded. Its residents, perhaps with heavy hearts, packed up their essential belongings and moved to higher ground, leaving behind the stone bones of their past to be slowly consumed by the ocean. The structures you found were not designed to withstand a sudden, cataclysmic blow, but rather the slow, grinding erosion of time and tide. They were the last, stubborn remnants of a slow retreat, the final goodbyes etched in stone. The silence of the deep, where these ruins now lay, felt heavy with the weight of this prolonged farewell. It was a story not of sudden wrath, but of slow, environmental inevitability. Atlantis wasn't annihilated, it simply dwindled, its light slowly dimming as the waters rose, until it slipped beneath the waves, not with a bang, but with the quiet, mournful sigh of a land saying its final farewell. The next step was to truly understand the marks this slow process left on the earth itself. The long, drawn-out goodbye of Atlantis, a slow surrender to the relentless forces of geology and climate, left an undeniable signature on the earth itself. It wasn't just about submerged ruins and scattered artifacts, it was about the very landscape bearing witness to a history of profound transformation. You and Leo, guided by Professor Sharma's increasingly intense focus, were now tasked with reading these subtle, yet undeniable, messages. You spent days poring over detailed bathymetric maps, the topographical maps of the ocean floor. These weren't the vague, artistic sketches of your old map, these were precise, high-resolution images generated by advanced sonar. And what they revealed was astonishing in its detail. Look at this, Professor Sharma pointed, her laser pointer dancing across a massive, deep-sea canyon system. This isn't just a random valley. The morphology here, the shape of the slopes, the sediment distribution, it suggests ancient riverbeds. Rivers that once flowed across dry land, now submerged. You leaned in, tracing the ghostly outlines of these ancient waterways. It was like seeing the capillaries of a vanished continent. Imagine the sheer volume of water that must have flowed through these now silent trenches, nourishing a landscape that was now thousands of feet beneath the waves. This wasn't just a small island, it was a substantial landmass, complete with its own drainage systems, its own geographical character, mainstream geological knowledge point. Submarine canyons are often formed by the erosion of sediment from rivers that once flowed across exposed continental shelves during periods of lower sea level. As sea levels rise, these river valleys become submerged, and their features are preserved, though often modified by currents and sediment deposition. So, finding evidence of ancient riverbeds on the ocean floor is a strong indicator of past landmass and significant sea level change. Then there were the paleoshorelines. These were faint, almost imperceptible terraces or ridges on the continental shelf, thousands of feet below the current sea level. They represented ancient coastlines, where the ocean had paused its relentless climb during periods of relative stability. Each terrace was like a silent monument to a bygone era, a marker of where the Atlanteans might have built their homes or launched their boats, centuries before the waves claimed it all. These terraces are crucial, Leo explained, his finger tracing a particularly well-defined paleo-shoreline. They tell us not just that the sea level rose, but how fast and when it paused. Each one is a chapter in the story of this land's slow demise. That here's a rather sobering geological fact: the process of isostatic rebound can also play a role in landmass changes. After massive ice sheets from an ice age melt, the land that was once pressed down by their immense weight can slowly rebound or rise. Conversely, areas that were outside the ice sheets but near them might have experienced a bulge that later subsided. So, while global sea level rise is a major factor, local geological uplift or subsidence can make the picture even more complex, and academics are still hotly debating the specific interplay of these forces in ancient coastal changes. You pictured the Atlanteans looking out at one of these ancient shorelines, knowing that one day, perhaps their children's children would see it disappear. Did they build new structures on the next, higher terrace, a silent acknowledgement of the inevitable? Did their oral histories record the incremental loss, the steady retreat inland? The Earth itself, through these subtle geological features, was answering those questions with a quiet, undeniable yes. Beyond the riverbeds and paleo-shorelines, there were also sediment cores. These were long, cylindrical samples of the seafloor, carefully extracted by drilling. They were like a layered cake of history, with each layer representing a different period of time. Professor Sharma was particularly excited about these. Look at the composition here, she said, pointing to a dark band in one of the cores. This is a very high concentration of terrigenous sediment, land-derived material, like clay and silt, mixed with freshwater diatom remains. It suggests a period when this area was much closer to land, perhaps even a freshwater lake or estuary, before it was inundated by the ocean. That it was a window into a vibrant, living ecosystem that had once existed where now only silent deep-sea currents flowed. It wasn't just rock, it was the ghostly imprint of a thriving environment, a testament to a world that was undeniably real, undeniably vibrant, and now undeniably lost. Without a quirky archaeological insight, sometimes, the most compelling evidence for human presence in a landscape that's now submerged isn't grand ruins, but microscopic remains. Pollen grains, ancient seeds, or the fossilized remains of freshwater organisms found in sediment cores can reveal what kind of vegetation existed on a now submerged landmass, and even suggest agricultural practices or human alteration of the environment. It's like finding a ghost's footprint by examining the dust on the floor. The remnants of Atlantis weren't just the few scattered artifacts or the faint outlines of walls. They were etched into the very fabric of the Earth's crust, in the contours of the ocean floor, in the layered history within the sediment cores. The planet itself held the memory of this lost civilization, a memory expressed not in words or legends, but in the irrefutable language of geology. This wasn't a sudden, fantastical disappearance. It was a slow, majestic, and utterly heartbreaking geological process, spanning millennia. The Earth had shifted, the ice had melted, the waters had risen, and a civilization, resilient and resourceful as it might have been, had simply run out of dry land. The evidence of Atlantis wasn't a smoking gun, but a vast, sprawling crime scene, meticulously documented by nature itself. And you, with your science and your curiosity, were finally learning to read its silent, profound testimony. You had pieced together the geological puzzle, the tectonic shifts, the volcanic eruptions, the relentless creep of rising sea levels. You had even found the subtle, yet undeniable, marks these processes left on the Earth itself. But there was still the lingering question: if Atlantis wasn't a sudden, cataclysmic divine punishment, then why did the myths persist with such dramatic flair? Why the tales of golden palaces, advanced technology, and a morally corrupt society swallowed by the sea in a single day? The answer, you realized, lay in the fascinating, often distorted, way human memory and oral tradition work. Imagine a vast game of telephone played out over thousands of years and across continents. A real event, perhaps a series of devastating but gradual environmental changes, gets passed down from generation to generation. Each retelling adds a little flourish, a bit of exaggeration, a moral lesson, or simply misinterprets a scientific reality through the lens of early human understanding. Mainstream anthropological knowledge point. Oral traditions are incredibly powerful vehicles for transmitting knowledge and history across generations, especially in pre-literate societies. However, they are also subject to transformation. Details can become embellished, simplified, or combined with other stories. Over long periods, real historical events can morph into myths or legends, often incorporating cultural values, moral lessons, or explanations for natural phenomena. Academics are still actively debating the precise mechanisms by which historical memory is preserved and transformed in oral traditions. Consider the Golden Palaces. Perhaps the Atlanteans, skilled engineers facing constant erosion, developed unique building techniques using local, shimmering minerals or polished stones that glittered in the sun. Over millennia, this practical brilliance could easily be reinterpreted as actual gold, symbolizing unimaginable wealth and opulence in the collective memory. Advanced technology might have simply been their sophisticated understanding of agriculture in challenging conditions, or their innovative maritime skills, or even their accurate prediction of tremors, all of which would have seemed almost magical to less environmentally attuned neighbors. The idea of wise philosopher kings might have stemmed from their leaders' profound, hard-won knowledge of the Earth's cycles and their community's resilience in the face of constant environmental threat. In a world where every tremor and every rising tide brought new challenges, practical wisdom and adaptability would have been the most valuable assets. Here's a slightly whimsical thought: maybe the wise philosopher kings were just the really good meteorologists and geologists of their day, who could predict when a major storm was coming or when an area was becoming unstable. To people without that knowledge, their predictions would seem like profound foresight, elevating them to almost godlike status. It's all about perspective, isn't it? And then, the sinking in a single day and night. This is where the human element truly transformed the geological reality. A civilization experiencing a gradual, centuries-long decline due to rising sea levels and intermittent seismic activity isn't a dramatic narrative, but a powerful, hubristic empire suddenly swallowed by the sea due to divine wrath. That's a story that sticks. It's entirely plausible that the final, most devastating events, a particularly strong earthquake combined with a massive tsunami, might have been so overwhelming and so destructive that they effectively wiped out the last vestiges of the coastal settlements in a very short, terrifying period. For survivors or witnesses, this would have been the cataclysm, the defining moment of loss. The long, slow retreat that preceded it would fade from memory, eclipsed by the shocking finality of the disaster. You remembered the elders' stories about the stone-hearted giant Gien awing at the land. This wasn't a literal giant, but a metaphorical explanation for plate tectonics and sea level rise. The human mind, in its attempt to comprehend vast, incomprehensible natural forces, often personifies them, turning abstract processes into relatable narratives of gods, giants, or magical beasts. The myths, then, were not lies, but allegories, ancient attempts to make sense of a world shaped by forces far beyond human control. Academics are still hotly debating the truth behind many ancient myths, particularly those involving natural disasters. Some believe they are direct retellings, others that they serve purely as moral parables, and still others that they are a blend of both, reflecting historical events through a cultural and interpretive filter. The story of Atlantis serves as a powerful case study for this very debate. The hubris of the Atlanteans, which Plato emphasized as the cause of their downfall, might simply be a cultural overlay. Plato, a philosopher, was keen to teach moral lessons. A powerful civilization humbled by its own arrogance fit his philosophical narrative perfectly. He took the existing whispers of a lost land and adapted them to suit his didactic purpose, transforming a geological tragedy into a moral fable. So, the whispers of Atlantis that had first drawn you in, the dramatic tales of golden cities and sudden disappearances, weren't entirely false. They were echoes, distorted and magnified by the passage of time and the crucible of human storytelling. They were the blurry, fantastical memory of a very real place, a very real people, who had lived through a profound and agonizing environmental transformation. The myth was the beautiful, tragic, amplified song sung over the silent grave of a very real historical reality. And you, with your scientific tools and your understanding of human nature, were finally able to translate that song back into the language of the earth. The final piece of the puzzle was to appreciate the lasting legacy of this quiet, drawn-out goodbye. You had journeyed from dusty books to deep-sea ruins, from scientific data to ancient whispers. The dramatic, mythical Atlantis had slowly dissolved, replaced by a far more poignant and scientifically plausible reality. The story wasn't one of divine wrath or technological hubris, but of a long, drawn-out geological ballet, a slow goodbye between a land and its people. Atlantis, you now understood, didn't vanish. It merely went to sleep, a very, very deep and long sleep, under the watchful eye of the ocean. The final piece of this sprawling puzzle was to consider its ultimate fate, its quiet descent into oblivion. The structures you found, the robust foundations, the ancient tools, the enigmatic disk, were not remnants of a sudden, violent end. They were the silent witnesses to a prolonged process of subsidence, erosion, and eventual submersion. The land had slowly dipped, the waters had slowly risen, and the occasional seismic shock had merely accelerated the inevitable. Imagine the last few generations. Perhaps they saw the writing on the metaphorical wall, or rather, the literal water line. The coastal settlements would have been abandoned first, leaving their stone skeletons to be gradually softened by the waves, their details obscured by sediment. People would have retreated to higher ground, carrying their most cherished possessions, their stories, and the bitter knowledge that their homeland was shrinking, day by day, year by year. Mainstream archaeological understanding, the concept of site abandonment is a common phenomenon in archaeology. Settlements can be abandoned for various reasons: environmental changes, like resource depletion or climate shifts, economic shifts, warfare, or simply the decline of a ruling power. When a site is gradually abandoned, it typically leaves behind fewer artifacts in situ, in their original place, and shows signs of orderly departure, rather than catastrophic destruction. This aligns perfectly with what you found, the legend. of Atlantis being swallowed in a single night probably encapsulates the final visible inundation, the moment when the last remaining coastal areas, perhaps those deemed too valuable to leave until the very last moment, finally succumbed. It wouldn't have been the destruction of an entire continent in an instant, but the dramatic, irreversible loss of the last significant land features. For those who witnessed it, or heard the stories, that moment would forever be imprinted as the day of misfortune. The sheer depth at which you found the structures also speaks volumes. It indicates that the land was exposed during a period of significantly lower sea levels, likely during the last glacial maximum thousands of years ago. As the ice melted and sea levels rose, this ancient landmass became gradually submerged. This process wasn't completed overnight, it unfolded over thousands of years, a geological timescale that dwarfed the span of human lives. Here's a slightly morbid, but historically relevant, thought: many human settlements are built in vulnerable coastal or riverine areas because these locations offer vital resources and transportation advantages. This inherent vulnerability often means that human history is punctuated by natural disasters. The story of Atlantis, therefore, isn't unique in its tragedy, but rather a grand, compelling example of a universal challenge faced by countless ancient civilizations, living with the often indifferent power of nature. The lost knowledge of Atlantis, so often portrayed as advanced futuristic technology, was likely the sophisticated wisdom of a people who mastered survival in a geologically active, climatically changing environment. Their power was their resilience, their ability to adapt and endure in the face of such overwhelming natural forces for millennia. They weren't defeated by external enemies or moral failings, but by the slow, relentless, and ultimately unstoppable forces of the planet itself. Academics are still active, debating the historical accuracy of Plato's account of Atlantis, with opinions ranging from pure allegory to a distorted memory of real events like the eruption of Thera, Santorini. However, the evidence you've gathered points to a plausible scenario where a substantial landmass, perhaps inhabited by a resourceful people, gradually succumbed to well-understood geological and climatic processes. The myth acts as a powerful, poetic container for a very real, very human story of loss and adaptation. So, Atlantis didn't sink in a flash of divine retribution. It slowly settled, like an old house sighing into its foundations. The waves gently lapped higher and higher, the earth beneath it trembled occasionally, and the sky sometimes rained ash. Its inhabitants, resourceful and resilient, moved on, taking their stories and their sorrow with them. What remains today, thousands of feet below the surface, is not a forgotten empire but a silent monument to human persistence and the Earth's unstoppable power. It's a testament to a world that simply went to sleep, dreaming now of ancient sunrises and the footsteps of a people long gone. The ship's engines hum softly now, a lullaby against the vast silence of the ocean. The screens, once alive with sonar data and underwater images, have dimmed, reflecting only the faint glow of the stars outside. You lean back, feeling the gentle rise and fall of the waves, a rhythm that has cradled this planet for eons, and will continue to do so long after our own whispers fade. The story of Atlantis, once a roar of myth and mystery, has settled into a quiet hum of understanding. It wasn't a world of dramatic special effects, but a place where ordinary people faced extraordinary challenges, their lives unfolding on a stage that was slowly, patiently, sinking beneath them. Their final goodbye wasn't a scream, but a sigh, a slow surrender to the forces that shaped their very existence. The ocean, ancient and wise, holds their secrets now, whispering them only to the deep currents and the silent, knowing fish. Let your thoughts drift, like gentle currents, away from the shores of waking, and out into the vast, calming ocean of dreams. Allow the gentle rocking of the waves to lull you deeper, deeper, into a peaceful slumber. The mystery is solved, the story told. All that remains is the quiet peace of knowing.